Good morning, MacLaren. Today I'm going to talk to you about the game of life, developed by John Conway, a British mathematician, between 1968 and 1970. The game of life is not a game in the typical sense, it's more of a simulation of life and death. The game of life uses very simple rules. The rules are about cells on a cellular grid that can either be alive or dead. So every cell has 8 neighbors. If you look at this blue cell, it has the 3 neighbors on top, the 2 left and right, and the 3 on the bottom. So that's a total of 8 neighbors. And on the next time step, the cell will either survive or die. So a cell will die if it only has 1 or 0 neighbors because of loneliness or underpopulation. So this blue cell only has 1 neighbor and it doesn't make it to the next round. The black cell likely also would perish because it doesn't have neighbors, but this slide is just showing the blue cells. So if a cell has 4 or more neighbors, it dies from overpopulation. So this blue cell has too many neighbors and it doesn't make it to the next time iteration. If a dead cell has exactly 3 neighbors, it becomes alive through a process called reproduction. So this models a new life form being born. And finally, if a cell has 2 or 3 living neighbors, it stays alive. That's the exact number for a cell to live. Now, John Conway played around with a lot of different configurations, and this is the one he found out, he came up with that he thought was best, that you could mess around and see what happens with different ones. John Conway also figured out all of this without using a computer. He did this by hand at the table at a math department in Cambridge. So some life forms like single cells will disappear in the next time step because they have no neighbors. And so those aren't terribly interesting. And then the still lives aren't terribly interesting either because they don't do anything. All of the living cells here in the block, the beehive, the loaf, the boat, and the tub, they all have 2 or 3 neighbors, and none of the dead cells have 3 living neighbors. So nothing's changing in these configurations. So these are called still lives, and they aren't terribly fascinating because nothing's happening. Things get really interesting when we start talking about oscillators, though. An oscillator is a configuration that repeats. It just keeps doing the same thing, but it's changing its life forms. So a horizontal block of 3 becomes a block of 3 vertically because the endpoints have 1 neighbor, the middle guy, and the other points have 3 living neighbors, so they come into existence. So this pattern just keeps on repeating. This is an oscillator with period 2 because there are 2 different cycles that the blinker goes through. This oscillator is 2 blocks that would be stable, but because they're touching, these corners have 4 neighbors, and then they annihilate each other. But then they come right back because they are squares with 3 living neighbors. The patterns quickly become too complicated to explain what's going on, as you'll see in the next one. This is an oscillator with 3 distinct phases. You can see the empty phase, the kind of the line phase there, and then this insect face looking phase. And what exactly is happening is hard to say. You'd have to look at each cell individually, but you can see that the patterns quickly become very complicated and hard to predict without going through every cell and determining what will happen. So imagine trying to do this all by hand, like John Conway did. Now, if you're interested in finding your own, there's a website I'll show you in a moment. The next one is called a spaceship. This spaceship is an object that travels through the grid. So the cells up here keep getting deleted and new ones are made over here. There are many different types of spaceships that have been discovered in the game of life. This one here is called a glider. One of the questions that John Conway wanted to know early on was, could you make an infinite number of alive cells from some starting configuration? And if we go to this website here called playgameoflife.com, we can actually look at different life forms in the game of life by going to the lexicon, and you can actually see that there are hundreds of different names and varieties in the game of life that do different things, different types of oscillators, different types of generators, and they have all sorts of names of weird things that they do. The one I'm going to show you is called the Gosberg glider gun. This answered John Conway's original question, can you make an infinite number of cells? And the answer is yes. Bill Gosper at MIT discovered this configuration here. Those shouldn't be there. where an infinite number of gliders are made from this configuration. And then this area up here just kind of oscillates back and forth. So if you go to the website, you can change the speed down here with this slider. So if we run it, you can see that the objects will bounce back and forth and produce gliders every once in a while. So here you can see a glider starting to form. You can't really see it come into existence until the very end. And you'll see when they come back, they'll actually form another glider. I'm going to speed it up a little bit. And now you can see the second glider is coming into existence. If we speed it up a little bit more, you can see lots of gliders come into existence. And this proved that you could have an infinite number of cells be made by a finite starting point, which is really interesting. This whole game of life is actually an example of something called a cellular automata. Cellular automata were discovered by John von Neumann, a scientist, mathematician in the 1940s. And the ideas behind cellular automata were researched and explored more by Stephen Wolfram, who wrote A New Kind of Science in the early 2000s. Cellular automata model abstract computational systems with discrete states. What does that mean? Well, basically, you have some states being alive or off, or alive or dead. That's the discrete part. And it can actually model any type of computation, something called Turing complete, which basically means it can do what a computer can do. It can write programs, it can do calculations, and all sorts of things. This has some really interesting implications that this game of life can actually model what your computer does. Not that anyone would use it for that, because it's not very efficient to make, but it can be done. One of the interesting results from that is it's actually really hard to say whether or not a starting configuration will live or will die. So if we look at the next slide here, this is called a die-hard Methuselah. It actually lives for 130 cycles before it goes away. And it's actually impossible to predict whether or not a general configuration will live forever or will die, which I find absolutely mind-blowing, that we can't decide whether or not a set of starting cells will live or die. If we know what will happen, if we know the configuration, then we can tell. But in general, we can't say for sure whether or not some cells will survive or not. I'm going to show you a quick video called the Epic Conway Game of Life. And in this video, you can see different configurations. You can see some of the Gosper glider guns, and you'll also see some of them annihilating each other. Pay attention to notice for one of them, you'll see some spaceships forming, which I think is really cool, and enjoy. There's also some epic music to go along with it. Unfortunately, John Conway passed away earlier this year in April from complications caused by COVID-19. John Conway was a great mathematician who was curious throughout his career and discovered many interesting ideas in mathematics. I hope you learned something today about the game of life and that you found it beautiful, as I did, how simple rules can evolve into complex, beautiful structures. Stay curious and have a wonderful day.